Welcome to the Deep Collaboration Podcast. My name is Max Andocker, and I'm the co-founder and CPO of CoStream. In today's episode, we'll be celebrating the 10th anniversary of mob programming alongside a true expert on the topic, Austin Chadwick from the Mob Mentality Show. We'll dig deeper into mobbing during remote working and the differences between mobbing and pairing. I hope you'll enjoy it. Very welcome, Austin. Can you tell me a bit more about yourself and what you do with the Mob Mentality podcast and at Hunter Industries?
Yeah, great. I'm really excited to be here on the show, and this is just a lot of fun. So thank you, Max. And I'm a software engineer at Hunter Industries and also on the Mob Mentality podcast. And basically, what we love to talk about on the Mob Mentality podcast is a lot of things similar to what we're talking about here, is how to collaborate well. And specifically, we talk all things agile and product development from a mob programming perspective. And so, I can define mob programming or get into that if you like. But basically, in the podcast and my day-to-day work, just love collaborating with people, primarily through mob programming.
Super interesting. Thank you, Austin. How did you get into mob programming to begin with?
Yeah, so mob programming is coming up on its 10-year anniversary, where it was discovered and called that. It's also called other things like ensemble programming or group programming. But it's basically, I came into the scene a few years ago through some excellent extreme programming training by David Bernstein. He taught us pair programming, and I really enjoyed it a lot. We started experimenting with my team. And then we hired somebody who had done mob programming before, and we were kind of sharing some concerns we had with pairing. And pairing was great, but there were some issues we were having, and he's like, oh, maybe we should try mobbing. And so then we we set up like a cheap mob programming station. This is pre-COVID days where you can mob in person, and with just threw together a computer and chairs and kind of threw some cubicle walls around an area in some part of a building no one was using, and we were experimenting with mobbing. And I came to love it so much that I became to be a Hunter fanboy because Hunter is where mob programming was discovered. And so I, visited Hunter, brought several of my teams there, learned how they mob and how they do software development collaboratively. And then after a while, I ended up working there and then doing mob programming full time.
Thank you very much. I think what you said is you started pairing and then that evolved into mob programming. Can you tell me bit more about the difference between pairing and mobbing and what you see as the key benefits to mobbing over pairing?
Sure. Yeah. So, with pair programming, the idea is to, instead of one person working on a computer and then another person working on a computer, and then they, code review their work and then, merge it and that kind of thing. It's two people working on the same computer, and there are various styles of doing pair programming. I think pair programming is excellent, and I think when mobbing was discovered, it was basically I think Woody Zuhl talked about basically Kent Beck's idea of turning up the good, and so how extreme programming, when it originally came around, was take all the dials on the good things and just turning them up. What they kind of discovered, somewhat accidentally, was that turning up the good on collaboration, so having more than one person, more than two people at the keyboard, they tried that out, and things just worked really, really well for a number of reasons. And so there's a couple of community definitions, primarily inspired by Woody Zuhl, but so the kind of more actionable definition of mob programming is all the brilliant minds at the same, working on the same thing at the same time in the same space, and the thing that makes it more mobbing is on the same computer. And then a more kind of general definition is let's work well together and turn up the good on flow efficiency. And so I think what that emphasizes, instead of like a back-end person working on some code and then that being integrated and reviewed by a front-end person, and then you have all these queues building up, it's like have the back-end, the front-end, the DevOps, the QA, the security person all together and work on the one thing and get it to production right away, instead of it going through all these queues and waiting. So yeah, that's what comes to mind for me for mobbing versus pairing.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, what I find interesting is, of course, in the remote first world we live in today, a lot of people talk about asynchronous work and how you have to, as a team, work more asynchronously. Of course, when it comes to mobbing or pairing, you have to work synchronously. What are your thoughts on that? Like, first of all, how much time do you spend actually mobbing per week, or how much time does your team spend mobbing? And how do you see the balance, striking the right balance between asynchronous work and synchronous in the form of mobbing?
Yeah, and I think flow efficiency is the key. And every context is different, and so that's one thing we say often on the show is we're not recommending, we're just sharing what's worked in our context. Your context is going to be very different,
Yeah.
But I think if most significant work in software, and I think in many other disciplines, requires more than one pair of eyes on it, right? And it requires collaboration with more persons than yourself. So I think there's like a Woody Zool quote where he's like, well, if you can fulfill all the roles that are needed to get a product out the door, then yeah, you can do it all yourself and you don't need to collaborate with anybody. But if you do need all those different things, and flow efficiency is the most important as opposed to resource efficiency. So it's almost like throughput. Like we idea, start the work, and then the work is in production, providing value to customers. In our experience, the most efficient way to do that is mobbing, where everyone comes together. The review happens as it's being made by all the different pairs of eyes, and it goes out the door. And so in that regard, the asynchronous work is very, very low for me typically of late. So there are a few things that are asynchronous, but it's kind of the exception instead of the rule, because basically we're just focused on flow efficiency, and that often means we're just all working on it synchronously together to move that one item all the way to done. So as far as to your other question of how much time, as of right now, my current mobbing is 7 hours out of an 8-hour day is mob programming. And then we have an hour of learning. And then most of that work during that 7 hours is synchronous. But when we can't help it, there'll be some asynchronous, like we're waiting for someone to provide us, for example, an SVG or something like that we need for our work. So.
I mean, that's incredible. I don't think I've ever heard of a team that spends so much time mobbing or mob programming together in real time. So that's really fascinating. I think it's the counterexample to how many other organizations are structuring their remote work today, where they want to go as asynchronous as possible. Of course, I can imagine a common critique to this setup is that I don't want to put all my engineers working on the same computer in the same room. There's a cost to that, right? In terms of resources. What would you answer to someone bringing that point up?
Yeah, and it's a very valid concern, because I think the idea is if you're measuring resource efficiency, right? Like how busy are people? And I think this doesn't describe everybody, but I think the often perspective is efficiency is typing on the keys and producing code output software, right? And time spent me focused on a computer alone. And so the highest utilization of that would be everyone working separately, right? And so in my experience, I've been in 3 radically different stages of ways of doing software development. So from like rational unified process, extremely waterfall heavy, to more Scrum, and then now the more mob programming. And what I remember from both the waterfall, rational unified process, and Scrum is that, especially with the waterfall, the queues were huge, right? So it'd be like someone works alone on a design document for 50 features, and then they hand it over to a developer, and they work alone on those 50 features, and then they hand it over to QA. And so it would take very long to get done anything, provide anything of value. And so there's these big batches, and there's these long review cycles, and then the issues would be found, and then they'd go back and forth and go back and forth. So before anything got to production, it was a very long time. And then in a more Scrum environment with solo programming, the queuing was better, but there were still significant queues, a lot. So it'd be like, me or someone else would work on something individually, and then there would have to be a code review by several others, and then after that code review, it would go to QA, and then QA would work on it. And so there was a lot of waiting for other people. And so I start working on something, and then I'm waiting for someone else to review it. So I start working on something else. And so you have lots of inventory building up. So from like a lean perspective, if you're looking at the factory floor, there would just be like piles of partially completed work all everywhere, right? And so from like a flow efficiency perspective, there's a lot of busy people, but there's not a lot of output or not a lot of outcomes happening for the customer, right? Where I feel like what mobbing does is it focuses more on, hey, what is the customer getting today, and what feedback are we getting from them? You know what I mean? So it's like, let's work on one thing for as many people it makes sense in your context. We get it all the way to done, get it to production, get feedback on that, and then work on the next thing. And so it feels crazy and counterintuitive, and I totally get that. But then when you just try it and see the differences between throughput, it becomes clear why, at least to me, why it works in many contexts.
So has it significantly shortened the delivery cycles for you, or is it more a question of getting more into each cycle?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, if I compare kind of the Scrum solo program model, and this is just my experience, the cycles to get something valuable to production were at its best a couple weeks, and often months or a year, depending upon which team and how they're operating, to get something valuable that we can get feedback from in production. And then the first day I did mob programming full time, we worked on something and released to production that day, and I was just blown away. I'm like, what is happening right now?
Incredible. I think that's something we would all like to experience.
Yeah. So for me, just by experience, the difference was obvious. And we can put stuff in the show notes, people who describe it better than me in more financial or management terms. But from the kind of, on the field experience kind of thing, that's how I've seen the difference. Yeah.
Excellent. It's fascinating. How would you recommend the team getting started with mob programming? I can imagine that it's a bit of a learning curve before you get to the 7 hours per day setup, coming from more of a solo type Scrum setup, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, we do that because we love it, that there's a group of people who love working that way, and we want to work that way, and it's basically by volunteer. And there are many teams who mob program and pair or do parallel work, and then some solo development, and they basically find their sweet spot of the different practices that works for them in their context, and that's great. So I guess for me, I'm not saying if you're mob, you must mob, all day or else, kind of thing. But to answer your question more directly, there are many great ways to get started. There are a lot of, if you're looking to just experiment with it, and you're, a developer or a QA, or you're someone, kind of non-management, so to speak, or don't have those kind of levers or influence, there are ways to just kind of invite, and share, just be like, Alex Bird, he's introduced mob programming at several places, and he's done it kind of more from the peer-to-peer approach. And it'd be like, let's have a meeting to design the API between these two teams or two components. And he would be like, oh, that's great. Hey, and at the meeting, why don't we just open up that code and start working on it? And then he kind of starts driving, and then he's like facilitating the input from the rest of the mob or the meeting. And then they're working on the API together. So you basically take a meeting and turn it into a working meeting as a way to try it.
You kind of hijack the meeting and turn it into a mob session.
You do it by invite. You say, oh, would you like to try this? And they say no. That's like, okay. But usually most people are open to try it for an hour or something like that. You can, share, have I don't know how you do it these days remotely, but, a lunch and learn, or let's watch a video together. Woody Zool's got a lot of great videos on mobbing. And then you can say like, okay, this is what it is. Would anybody like to try this for the next, story or the next sprint or the next day? And then maybe out of the team of 20, only 2 people are interested. And then there's your mob. If it's only one person, you can start with pairing. And then you can let the diffusion of innovation play out. Like you run an experiment, you share how it goes, and then more people will join it. Or it fizzes away because maybe it doesn't work in your context, or you need to try again in a different way. But yeah, those are some things that come to mind.
Do you prefer mobbing in person or remotely? And sort of how have you bridged this during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think if you would have asked me a year ago, I hadn't tried remote mob programming or remote pairing, and I was suspicious of it. I was very suspicious of it. But of course, the pandemic has caused you to try all sorts of things. And so now I feel like remote mobbing and pairing works really well remotely. And because of kind of work-life balance type things, I prefer remote. It's fantastic to be at home and then to walk down the stairs and hang out with my wife and kids on a break or at lunch, and then go walk upstairs and go back to work. And so I just really love the remote lifestyle and being close with my wife and family. And so, yeah, I think it takes a little bit of experimentation to get it to work. And so to find out your tool set that works well for you and your context. But once you get through that experimentation and figure it out, it works really nicely. You start to trick your brain that the pixels of Max I'm seeing right now is the real Max, and then you just start talking to the pixels as if it's really Max, and then it feels like you're in person mobbing or pairing.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about tooling, and of course, me representing ColdScreen. ColdScreen is a tool that can be used for this, but it's only for Mac OS so far. And I know that I believe you're mostly on Windows, so you haven't had a chance to use it that extensively. But I'm a bit curious just in terms of how you reason around tooling and what you use today and what you've found working for you in a remote context.
Yeah, and I think CoScreen looks fantastic, and we kind of have tried it out as a beta user standpoint for the reasons you talked about. But I love what it does, and the fact that you can share from both computers, and it just really enables collaboration really well. So I think that looks really exciting. For currently what we do, there's a whole bunch of different things that people do in the mobbing and pairing community, from get handover tools. So your video sharing, your video conferencing something with video and audio, have your tool of choice there, company tool of choice. And then you share your screen, and then so everyone can see your screen, and you're driving and the rest of the team might be navigating or talking about what to do next. And then when your turn is over, you push it up using a mob tool to a Git branch, and then the next person gets it and pulls it down. And so there's this tool that kind of facilitates the driver and the navigators and the rest of the mob. I haven't actually used that tool set. We've adopted more of a remote computer model because it just kind of fit with how we were mobbing before, because we had a in-person physical mob setup before where there was a mob station that everyone would sit around. You'd have your personal computer to research or do email or to run experiments on your computer, but there was a mob station that we would all, each mob would work at. And what we did is we just turned on tools like AnyDesk or TeamViewer, and then everyone from their home remotes into that same mob station.
Yeah.
And then from there we take turns, whether if you're freestyle mobbing where it's just kind of letting it flow, or you're having a timer based mobbing where you switch off who's driving, who's navigating, who's taking on other roles in the mob, like at 5 to 10 minute increments or something like that.
Speaking of tooling, what other tools do you use for communication in the team? Because I imagine there's more to it than when you're actually in these sessions, just to enable remote work efficiently.
Yeah. So we've been using Microsoft Teams, and so that is basically what was somewhat already set up for us, but it turns out pretty cool. So I mean, I think I've heard of Slack analogies as to what we're doing in Teams, but basically you have the different teams, and then each team has channels. And then so what you could have is like a team, for example, Team A, and then let's say there's 3 mobs for Team A. And then so there'll be 3 channels under Team A and be like mob 1, 2, and 3. And so within the Teams app, you can go look at all the different teams and then the mobs, and then you can see who's working in each team. So you go to like mob 1 under Team A, and and you can see like, oh, here are the 4 people, and it's got their pictures there, how long they've been mobbing, and I think they even put a lot of teams put the title of what they're working on as like the title of the meeting. And what that enables is kind of like what we used to do in person, which was like just walk from mob to mob. Like, hey, I have a question for this person. Let me go walk to that other mob in the same building and talk to them. You just kind of walk around in teams and see the other who's in what mob and what they're doing. And what it enables too is that our people we interact with in stakeholders and such, they know this setup as well. And so they can just pop into any mob and just instantly appear and say, I have a question, or we can pull them in. So yeah, that's another tool we've been using. And it also has chat functionality.
Yeah, and so interesting though. Would you say people, instead of writing a message like you normally would in a chat thread, people will pop into the mob and ask the question directly there?
Yeah.
And is that okay? You sort of, because you're interrupting the flow at the same time, right?
Yeah, I guess it just depends. Yeah. So and one analogy for mobbing is like a steamroller, right? And so you're investing a lot of people into this mob, right? And so you want to prioritize. You don't want a mob of people waiting around, right? So if they're waiting for a question, you want to deliver that instead of having a group of people waiting around. And so it just depends, So interrupt another mob could be bad, like interrupting their flow, like you said. So often if it's a short question, I'll just ping a message like, where is this? And they send a link and it's like done, kind of thing. But if it's something that takes collaboration, either then you schedule a meeting, or if it's high priority for our mob, like it's critical or something like that, I might send a message and be like, can we interrupt you now? Your whole mob, you really need to figure this out. And then because what I found is Slack or Teams or any chat thread is great for quick communication. But as soon as it becomes a conversation, I've spent 90% of the time typing when we could have just, over the, hour or whatever, when we could have just had a 5-minute conversation and figured it out pretty quickly.
Totally.
And so I guess it's, you develop a feel for when, hey, this is a quick question, or we need to figure stuff out. We should just call them and bring them in. You know what I mean? And that kind of thing.
Yeah. You mentioned in Microsoft Teams, so it's set up by team, and then you have different sub channels for different mobs. How many people would normally be in a mob at any given point in time? And like, are you deliberate about, the maximum size or the minimum size of a mob, or it just depends on the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah, and so the mob size is an interesting question. I think a good answer is it varies depending on the problem you're trying to solve, right? So if it's a very complex R&D discovery type problem that requires multiple disciplines, your mob size probably will increase. You know what I mean? So I think there's been like huge mobs at conferences where they're doing like cutting edge quantum stuff that no one understands, and you have someone driving at the like conference table, and then people are pitching ideas from the crowd, kind of thing. So that's like the mega mob kind of thing going on. And then so for things that are more like, there's a lot of knowns and only some unknowns, and it doesn't require 5 disciplines and only requires 3 disciplines to take an item all the way to done, then it can be a mob of 3. So it just varies. From my experience, I've typically been in mobs of 3 to 6 has been like the average for my experience. But
is that the sweet spot, or it just tends to be how?
That's just my experience.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think it just depends, like so many things, like so many other things.
Yeah, right. I know we're coming towards the end of this episode, but I've learned a ton already. Just curious to know, with 2020 having been a tough year that's behind us now, hopefully we have more to look forward to in 2021. What are you the most excited about coming into the new year?
I think, so I think mob programming and being with people and joy is like a big thing for me personally. And so I think there was a quote from someone else experienced what I experienced, which was someone experienced a remote mob programming dojo, and they said, I'm having joy at the first time at work in a very long time. And I think there's something, exciting and fun about interacting with people, having a good time, and getting a lot, being very effective in achieving outcomes and producing value for customers. And so I think for me, something I'm looking forward to is just sharing that with more people. You know what I mean? So seeing the kind of the light bulb turn on for people when they first experience that is really fun. And of course, that comes with I think to mob well, you have to be kind, considerate, respectful, and treat people well. And I think it's kind of in many ways a return to an old way of a more classic or ancient way of learning and getting work done together. You know what I mean? And and I think there's something really unique and fun about that. So basically, just sharing that with more people, and whether it's in conferences where there's mobbing workshops or people visiting and coming to mob with us for a half day or a day or something like that.
Excellent. And myself, and I think many of our listeners, are definitely looking forward to learning more about this and hearing more from the Mob Mentality Show. I believe you will continue to produce episodes on this very topic to help people deep dive and convert from their current practices.
Yeah. You try it out. Maybe that's the call to action is, there's no guarantee that anything works, but if you feel like it may work, there's something that it's interesting to you, try it out and see if it works. You know what I mean? And see if it's something that works in your context.
Thank you so much, Austin. It's been a true pleasure talking to you. And I think on behalf of our listeners, I'd like to thank you. This is a super interesting topic and something I'm looking forward to getting more into in 2021.
Thank you so much. This has been a ton of fun, Max. Really appreciate it.